Hello, my dear listeners. Before we dive into today's story, I want to send a warm hug to Jenny Cozio from Las Vegas, Nevada, Margaret Hill from Bristol, England, and Daniel Alvarez from San Antonio, Texas. It's a joy to know that our stories are reaching hearts in so many corners of the world. And what about you? Tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I love seeing our little community growing. And who knows, maybe your name will be featured in the next video. Now, let's begin today's story. Vincent Barone, heir to the Barone hospitality empire, a sprawling kingdom of luxury hotels, exclusive restaurants, and shadowy backroom deals, sat at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. The air in the penthouse boardroom was thick with the scent of expensive leather and ambition. Before him lay the culmination of 6 months of brutal negotiations, a multi-billion-dollar merger agreement with Lombardi Holdings, a rival conglomerate. It was a deal that would solidify his family's dominance for the next generation. His business partner, Marco, sat to his right, his face flushed with victory. The Lombardi representatives sat opposite, their smiles sharp and predatory. All that was left was the signature. Vincent picked up the heavy, gold-nibbed fountain pen. He uncapped it, the small click echoing in the silent, tense room. He poised the pen over the signature line, the final act of a long and arduous war. Just as the nib was about to touch the paper, the door opened discreetly. A young waitress, Lily Adams, slipped into the room to clear the empty coffee cups. She moved with a quiet, practiced efficiency, her simple black uniform a stark contrast to the tailored Italian suits of the men at the table. She was a ghost in their world of power and money, a part of the scenery, utterly invisible. She moved around the table, her movements silent, her eyes downcast. As she reached Vincent's side, she leaned in, ostensibly to pick up his empty espresso cup. But as she did, her lips brushed past his ear, and she whispered 3 urgent, desperate words. "Don't sign it." The whisper was so soft it was almost a breath, but it hit Vincent with the force of a physical blow. He froze, the pen hovering just millimeters from the paper. "It's a trap," she breathed, her voice a frantic, terrified murmur. And then she was gone. She straightened up, collected the cup, and walked out of the room without a single backward glance, leaving a trail of chaos in her wake. The pen slipped from Vincent's numb fingers, clattering onto the polished table. He slowly lifted his head, his gaze fixed on the empty doorway where she had just been. His mind was reeling. "Vincent?" Marco asked, his voice laced with a feigned, sycophantic concern. "Is everything all right?" "I need 5 minutes." Vincent's voice, calm and resolute, cut through the expectant silence. He stood up abruptly, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape that sounded like a gunshot in the tense room. "Vincent, what are you doing?" Marco hissed, his face a mask of confusion and annoyance. "We're about to close the biggest deal of our lives." The Lombardi representatives exchanged wary, irritated glances. "Is there a problem, Mr. Barone?" one of them asked, his voice smooth but edged with steel. Vincent ignored them all. His entire focus was on the door through which the waitress had disappeared. He walked out of the boardroom, leaving a wake of stunned, angry silence. He found her in the service corridor, her back pressed against the cool wall, her hands trembling as she tried to stack the collected coffee cups onto a tray. "Explain," he commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it was low and dangerous, echoing in the narrow, sterile hallway. "Now." Lily jumped at the sound of his voice, nearly dropping the cups. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a strange, defiant resolve. I heard them," she stammered, her voice a hushed, frantic whisper. "Your partner, Marco, and a woman. In his office earlier this morning. I was cleaning the hallway. They thought no one was listening." She took a shaky breath, the words tumbling out in a rush. They were talking about the merger, about how it was the final piece of their plan. They're going to use it to divert funds, to bankrupt the Barone Holdings from the inside, and transfer the assets to a shell company. They're going to take everything." Vincent stared at her, his expression an unreadable mask of stone. He was a man who lived in a world of lies, of half-truths and hidden agendas. He trusted no one. And yet, there was a raw, desperate honesty in her eyes that he couldn't dismiss. She had nothing to gain from this, and everything to lose. "Do you have proof?" he asked, his voice still dangerously quiet. She shook her head, her eyes filling with frustrated tears. "No, just what I heard. I know it sounds crazy, but I had to say something." He studied her for a long, silent moment, his mind racing. If she was lying, she was a fool, and he would crush her without a second thought. But if she was telling the truth— "If you are lying to me," he said finally, his voice a blade of ice, "your life in this city is over. I will make sure you never work again." He took a step closer, his presence overwhelming in the narrow corridor. "But if you are telling the truth—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. He turned without another word and walked back into the boardroom. He strode to the head of the table, picked up the thick contract folder, and closed it with a soft, definitive thud. "The signing is postponed," he announced to the shocked, sputtering room. "I require a final review of the terms." And as he walked out, leaving chaos in his wake, his gaze swept the room and landed on Marco. And for the first time, he saw not his trusted partner, but a snake hiding in plain sight. That night, the Barone Hospitality Empire's corporate headquarters, usually dark and silent, was alive with a single, focused energy. Vincent sat alone in his vast, top-floor office, the city lights a glittering, indifferent backdrop. He had dismissed his security, his driver, everyone. He needed to do this himself. He couldn't shake the waitress's warning, the desperate sincerity in her eyes. It went against every cynical, guarded instinct he had, but he couldn't ignore it. He started with the merger documents, the same ones his legal team had vetted for months. He spent hours poring over every clause, every subsection, every line of dense, legalistic text, searching for the trap she had mentioned. At first, he found nothing. The contract was ironclad, a masterpiece of corporate law. He began to feel a surge of anger, of foolishness. Had he just jeopardized a multi-billion-dollar deal based on the paranoid ramblings of a waitress? He was about to give up when he saw it. A single, innocuous line in the appendices, referencing a document he had never seen. See Annex D for full liability and asset transfer protocols. Annex D. He had never been shown an Annex D. His blood ran cold. He moved to his computer. Marco, as his partner, had high-level access, but certain files were kept in a personally encrypted partition on the company's server. Vincent, a man who trusted no one completely, had always had a back door into Marco's systems. He had never used it. Until now. It took him less than 10 minutes to bypass the encryption. He navigated through a series of decoy folders until he found it. A single password-protected file labeled simply Annex D. He stared at the password prompt. He thought of Marco, of their years of friendship, of the trust he had placed in him. He thought of the woman's voice Lily had mentioned. A woman. He typed in a single word, Isabella. The file opened, and Vincent's world fell apart. It wasn't just a document. It was a blueprint for a corporate coup. It detailed a meticulous, brilliant plan to leverage the merger's complex financial structure to systematically bleed the Barone Empire dry. Within 6 months, 80% of the family's liquid assets would be legally and irrevocably transferred to an anonymous holding company registered in the Cayman Islands. A holding company controlled by Marco and Isabella, his ex-fiancée, the woman who had left him years ago, claiming he was too soft, too sentimental to lead his family. He dug deeper into the encrypted files and found a hidden folder of audio recordings. He clicked on the most recent one. It was dated 2 days ago. He heard Marco's voice, smug and triumphant. "He trusts me completely. He'll never suspect a thing." And then he heard her laugh, a sound he had once loved, now a sound that twisted like a knife in his gut. "He always was naive," Isabella's voice purred. "Too much of his mother in him. It's why I left him, and it's why he's about to lose everything." The betrayal was absolute. It was total. It was a dagger not just in his back, but in the heart of his family's legacy, wielded by the two people he had once trusted most in the world. He sat there in the silent, dark office, the voices of their treachery echoing in his ears, and a cold, quiet, murderous rage began to build in his soul. The next morning, Marco arrived at the restaurant that housed their corporate offices, completely unaware that his world was about to implode. He was furious about the postponed signing, but he was more concerned with tying up the one loose end that could unravel his entire plan: the waitress. He strode into the main dining room just before the lunch rush, his face a mask of thunderous authority. "Emergency staff meeting," he announced, his voice booming. "Everyone, now." The entire restaurant staff, chefs, servers, busboys, hosts, gathered nervously in the center of the room. Lily stood among them, her heart pounding, a cold dread washing over her. Marco's eyes scanned the crowd and landed on her. "Lily Adams," he said, his voice dripping with a false theatrical disappointment. "Step forward." Trembling, she did as she was told. "It has come to my attention," Marco began, his voice projecting so everyone could hear, "that confidential company information may have been compromised, and that you," he pointed a finger at her, "were seen yesterday near a restricted office, a place you have no reason to be." He held up a grainy security photo, showing her in the service corridor outside his office. It was proof of nothing, but in his hands, it was a weapon. "I am a partner in this company," he declared, his voice ringing with self-righteous indignation. "And I will not tolerate theft or corporate espionage. Lily Adams, you are fired, effective immediately. Get your things and get out." The public humiliation was a physical blow. Her colleagues stared at her, a mixture of pity, suspicion, and fear on their faces. She was being branded a thief, her reputation destroyed, her livelihood stripped away in a matter of seconds. She looked around, desperate, her eyes searching for a friendly face, for anyone who might defend her. And then she saw him. Vincent had just walked into the restaurant, summoned to the emergency meeting by Marco himself. He stood at the back of the room, his face an unreadable mask, watching the entire scene unfold. Their eyes met across the room. Lily's gaze was a silent, desperate plea. "You know the truth. Please, say something." Everyone turned to look at Vincent. They all knew he was the real power, the final authority. They expected him to support his partner, to uphold the chain of command. Vincent looked at Marco, his expression cold, calculating. Then his gaze shifted back to Lily, and for a moment, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Regret, maybe? But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. With a calm, deliberate slowness that seemed to suck all the air out of the room, he spoke. "I'm sorry, Lily," he said, his voice flat, devoid of all emotion. Her heart shattered. He turned without another word and walked out of the restaurant, leaving her alone, abandoned, to face her public execution. The hours after her firing were a blur of shame and disbelief. Lily packed her few personal belongings from her locker in a daze, enduring the whispers and the pitying sidelong glances of her former co-workers. She walked home through the bustling city streets, feeling utterly, completely alone. He had abandoned her. The one man who knew the truth had watched her be humiliated and had done nothing. The betrayal felt even deeper than Marco's. That evening, there was a sharp, insistent knock on her apartment door. Her heart leaped into her throat. Was it Marco? Had he sent someone to threaten her, to ensure her silence? She crept to the door and looked through the peephole. It was Vincent. A surge of white-hot anger washed over her. She ripped the door open, intending to slam it in his face. "What do you want?" she spat. "Lily, wait," he said, his voice urgent. He put his hand on the door, preventing her from closing it. His strength was effortless, absolute. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "You have no right to be here. You stood there and let him destroy me." "I know," he said, and the raw, genuine pain in his voice made her pause. "I know how it looked. Please, just give me 5 minutes to explain." She stared at him, her heart at war with her head. She wanted to hate him, to scream at him, but the look in his eyes, a look of profound, gut-wrenching regret, held her in place. She finally stepped back, letting him into her small, modest apartment. "I found it, Lily," he said the moment the door was closed. "The Annex D, the shell companies, the recordings. I found everything. You were right." "Then why?" she whispered, the question a raw, open wound. "Why did you just stand there? Why did you let him do that to me?" "Because it was an act," he explained, his voice low, intense. "If I had defended you, if I had shown my hand in that moment, Marco would have known I was onto him. He would have erased everything. The recordings, the bank transfers, all of it. I needed him to think he had won. I needed him to feel safe." He took a step closer, his gaze pleading. "It was the hardest thing I've ever had to do. Watching him humiliate you. It took every ounce of my self-control not to kill him right there on the spot." She wanted to believe him. She could see the truth in his eyes, but the hurt was still too deep. He seemed to sense her hesitation. He let out a long, weary sigh, running a hand through his hair. "There's more," he said, his voice dropping, becoming vulnerable in a way she had never heard before. "When he stood you up there, accusing you, using lies to isolate you, he was using the same tactic my father used against me, years ago." He looked at her, his armor finally, completely cracking. "I was in love once," he confessed, the words sounding rusty, unused. "Her name was Elena. My father didn't approve. He saw her as a distraction, a weakness. So he created a lie. He framed her for stealing from the family. He forced me to choose between her and my loyalty to the family." He closed his eyes, the memory clearly still painful. "I chose the family. I abandoned her, and I have regretted it every single day of my life." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with a raw, profound shame. "When I saw Marco doing the same thing to you, for a second, I froze. I was back there, a weak boy letting his father dictate his life." He took her hands in his grip surprisingly gentle. "I am not going to make the same mistake twice, Lily," he said, his voice a low, fierce vow. "I am not going to abandon you." He looked at her, his gaze intense, unwavering. "I need your help. Not as a waitress, not as an informant. As a partner. Help me expose them. Help me take back what is mine." Lily stared at him, her mind reeling. He was asking for her help, calling her his partner. It was the last thing she had expected. The anger and hurt she had been nursing were still there, but they were now mixed with a confusing, reluctant flicker of something else. Intrigue. A part of her, the sensible, rational part, was screaming at her to throw him out, to run as far away from his dangerous world as she could. But another part, a part she hadn't known existed, was drawn to the raw honesty in his eyes, to the chance to be a part of something bigger, to the opportunity to bring down the man who had so publicly humiliated her. "What do you need me to do?" she asked, her voice a quiet whisper. A slow wave of relief washed over Vincent's face. "I need your mind," he said. "I need your eyes and ears." And so began their secret alliance. Lily, now officially fired, was a ghost. She had no reason to be at the corporate offices, no reason to interact with any of the staff, which made her the perfect secret weapon. They would meet late at night, in the silent, darkened confines of Vincent's office, a place Marco now believed was solely his domain. Vincent would disable the security cameras and let her in through a private entrance. The vast, luxurious office became their war room. He showed her everything: the real financial ledgers, the encrypted communications, the complex web of shell corporations. He expected her to be overwhelmed, confused by the sheer volume and complexity of the information. He was wrong. Lily, who had been forced to drop out of a prestigious finance program years ago to care for her ailing mother, came alive. The part of her brain that she had suppressed for years, the part that saw numbers not as abstract figures but as a language, a story, clicked into place. She spread the documents across the massive desk, her eyes scanning, connecting, analyzing. "He's sloppy here," she'd murmur, pointing to a discrepancy in a transfer log. "He's using the same 3 holding companies in a rotating pattern. It's predictable." Vincent watched her, utterly fascinated. He had seen the world's best forensic accountants, and none of them had the intuitive, almost artistic grasp of the numbers that she did. She wasn't just a smart waitress. She was a brilliant financial mind, a talent that life had forced into hiding. The power dynamic between them began to shift. He was no longer just the powerful boss offering protection. He was a student, learning from a master. "You're more qualified to run this company than half my board of directors," he said one night, his voice filled with a genuine, profound admiration as he watched her effortlessly untangle a complex money laundering scheme. He looked at her brow furrowed in concentration, at the cheap, worn-out cardigan she wore, and a new question formed in his mind. "Why are you serving tables, Lily?" he asked, his voice gentle. "With a mind like yours, you could be doing anything." The question seemed to startle her out of her concentration. She looked up from the papers, a flicker of old sadness in her eyes. "Life happens," she said with a small, sad shrug. "My mom got sick. I had to drop out of school to take care of her. The waitress job was flexible. After she passed, I guess I just got stuck. It was easier to stay where I was than to try and start over." The question, and her honest, unadorned answer, forced her to confront the dreams she had so carefully packed away, and it made Vincent see her in a new, even more brilliant light. She wasn't just his partner in this secret war. She was a queen in exile, and he was determined to help her reclaim her throne. "I'm having a dinner party," Vincent announced one evening, his voice deceptively casual. "At my penthouse, just a small, intimate gathering." Lily looked up from the financial charts she was analyzing. "A dinner party? Now? Are you insane?" "It's for Marco and Isabella," he explained, a cold, dangerous glint in his eyes. "A celebration of our impending merger. We need to keep them comfortable. We need them to believe they have won." A cold dread washed over Lily. "And what does that have to do with me?" "I've hired a private catering staff for the evening," he said. "And you," he paused, his gaze intense, "will be one of the waitresses." The plan was as brilliant as it was terrifying. It would put Lily right back in the room with them, a ghost in a black and white uniform, completely invisible, perfectly positioned to listen. The night of the dinner was a study in unbearable tension. Lily's hands trembled as she put on the uniform, the familiar fabric now feeling like a costume in a dangerous play. Vincent fitted a tiny, nearly invisible earpiece in her ear. "I'll be able to hear everything you hear," he murmured, his fingers brushing against her skin, sending a jolt of electricity through her. "And I can talk to you. Just be careful." She served the appetizers, her heart pounding with every step. Marco and Isabella barely glanced at her, their arrogance so complete that they didn't even recognize the woman they had publicly destroyed just days before. They were too busy gloating, toasting their success with Vincent's expensive champagne. "To new beginnings," Marco said, raising his glass to Vincent, "and to leaving the past behind." "I'll drink to that," Isabella purred, her hand resting possessively on Marco's arm. Lily moved silently around them, refilling wine glasses, clearing plates, her mind a steel trap, recording every word, every nuance, every whispered aside. Through the earpiece, Vincent's voice was a low, steady presence, guiding her, reassuring her. "Good, Lily. Now move closer to the window. They're talking about the final transfer." The tension reached its peak during the main course. Marco, in a show of boorish power designed to provoke Vincent, became irritated with the service. He called Lily over. "This wine is corked," he snapped, though it was perfectly fine. Then, with a deliberate, accidental movement, he knocked his full glass of red wine, spilling it down the front of Lily's clean white apron. "Clumsy girl," he sneered, a look of cruel amusement on his face. "Look what you've done. Go get cleaned up. You're a mess." The public humiliation, the casual cruelty, was a deliberate echo of the staff meeting. It was a power play, a way for Marco to assert his dominance in Vincent's own home. Through the earpiece, Lily heard Vincent let out a low, murderous growl. She could feel his rage from across the room, a palpable, vibrating force. He was supposed to play his part, to remain the gracious, oblivious host. But he didn't. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. "I think," he said, his voice a blade of ice that cut through the room, "this dinner is over." Marco and Isabella stared at him, shocked by his sudden cold fury. After they had been ushered out, leaving in a state of confused anger, Vincent turned to Lily. The room was silent, the air thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. He walked over to her, his eyes blazing with a protective rage that made her tremble. He took a napkin from the table and began to gently blot the red wine stain on her apron, his touch surprisingly tender. Their hands brushed, and the contact was electric, a spark in the tense, quiet room. "He shouldn't have touched you," Vincent whispered, his voice a low, rough growl. His anger was slowly, dangerously, transforming into something else, something that looked a lot like desire. The disastrous dinner party, while a failure in terms of maintaining their cover, yielded a crucial piece of information. In his arrogant gloating, Marco had let slip a detail to Isabella, a mention of a hard copy of the original, unannexed agreement. The one real signature, he had laughed. A little insurance policy, kept where no one would ever think to look. Working late into the night, Lily cross-referenced Marco's known properties with his personal calendar. "He has a standing appointment every Friday afternoon at the Heritage Hotel," she said, pointing to the screen. "He doesn't stay there. He just goes for a few hours. The hotel has private, long-term safes for its elite clients." "The company's annual gala is at that hotel," Vincent said, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "This Friday." The plan was set. The gala would be their cover. While Vincent kept Marco and Isabella distracted, Lily, using her knowledge of hotel service routes, would access the safe deposit box room and retrieve the final piece of evidence. The night of the gala was a glittering, high-stakes affair. The hotel ballroom was filled with the city's rich and powerful. Lily, dressed not as a waitress, but in a simple, elegant dark gown Vincent had provided, felt like she was moving through a dream. She stayed in the shadows, her heart pounding, waiting for Vincent's signal. When the time came, she slipped away from the party, her heart in her throat. She navigated the labyrinthine service corridors with a practiced ease, her old life as a waitress now an invaluable asset. She reached the secure room, her hands trembling as she used the keycard she had borrowed from a distracted security guard. She found the safe deposit box under a false name Marco often used. It took her precious minutes to pick the simple lock, a skill she hadn't known she possessed until Vincent had given her a crash course 2 nights before. Inside, she found it, the original contract, signed by Marco, with no mention of Annex D, the smoking gun. She was about to slip it into her clutch when a voice, cold and sharp as broken glass, spoke from behind her. "Looking for this?" Lily froze, her blood turning to ice. She turned slowly. Isabella stood in the doorway, a triumphant, venomous smile on her face. She wasn't dressed for a party. She was dressed for war. "I knew you were too smart to be a simple waitress," Isabella purred, taking a step into the room. "I've been having you followed. I knew you'd lead me right to Vincent's little secret." "It's over, Isabella," Lily said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We have everything." Isabella laughed, a high, chilling sound. "Oh, my dear, you have no idea." "You think this was about money?" She shook her head, her eyes glittering with a cold, hard fury. "This was never about money. It was about revenge." She took another step closer. "Vincent's father destroyed my family years ago. He bankrupted my father, drove him to an early grave. I have spent years planning this. Years waiting for the chance to take away everything Vincent holds dear, just like his father did to me." Before Lily could react, Isabella lunged forward, not at Lily, but at the fire alarm on the wall, smashing the glass and pulling the lever. The piercing shriek of the alarm filled the air. "Let's see who your hero saves now," Isabella hissed as she ran out of the room, slamming the heavy steel door behind her. Lily heard the sickening final click of the lock turning. She was trapped. And as the first wisps of smoke began to curl under the door from a smoke bomb Isabella had activated in the hallway, Lily realized this was never just about a corporate takeover. It was about burning everything to the ground. The piercing shriek of the fire alarm sent a wave of panic through the grand ballroom. Guests began to move toward the exits in a confused, murmuring mass. Vincent's eyes immediately scanned the crowd, searching for Lily. She was gone. A cold, primal fear, sharper than any he had ever known, seized him. Marco rushed to his side, his face a mask of feigned concern. "Vincent, we have to get out of here," he urged, grabbing his arm. "The contract is in the safe. We can get it later. We need to evacuate." He was trying to pull Vincent away from the service wing, away from the office where he knew Lily was. But Vincent wasn't listening. He had activated the small receiver for Lily's earpiece, and all he could hear was the deafening blare of the alarm and her faint, panicked coughing. She was still inside. He ripped his arm from Marco's grasp, his eyes blazing with a fury that made his partner flinch back. "The contract doesn't matter," he roared over the din, the words a raw, guttural cry of pure animalistic instinct. "She does." He turned and ran against the tide of fleeing guests, pushing his way through the crowd, his entire being focused on a single goal. He sprinted down the service corridor, the smoke growing thicker, burning his lungs. He reached the security office and saw the locked steel door, a red light blinking above it. He didn't waste time with keycards. He lowered his shoulder and slammed his full weight against the door. Once, twice. On the third try, the lock splintered, and the door flew open. The office was filled with thick, choking smoke. He saw her immediately. She was on the floor, near the far wall, slumped over, unconscious. He rushed to her side, scooping her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. She was limp, her face pale, her breathing shallow. "Lily," he choked out, his voice thick with smoke and terror. He turned to escape, but a loud, groaning crack echoed above them. A section of the ceiling, weakened by the heat, began to collapse, a shower of fiery debris raining down, blocking the doorway. They were trapped. The world was a roaring, suffocating inferno. Vincent stumbled back from the blocked doorway, shielding Lily's unconscious form with his own body as hot debris rained down around them. The smoke was a thick, black poison, stealing the air from his lungs. The heat was immense, blistering. He laid Lily gently on the floor in the far corner of the room, the spot furthest from the flames, and knelt beside her. He ripped off his suit jacket and placed it under her head, his movements frantic, desperate. "Lily," he choked out, his voice a raw, ragged whisper. He gently tapped her cheek. "Lily, wake up. Please, wake up." She didn't stir. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow and uneven. He looked around the burning office, at the flames licking up the walls, at the collapsed doorway. There was no way out. A profound, soul-crushing despair washed over him. He had failed. He had brought her into his world, promised to protect her, and he had led her here, to this fiery tomb. Believing these might be their last moments, the walls he had so carefully constructed around his heart for years crumbled into dust. The truth, a truth he had barely even admitted to himself, came pouring out in a torrent of grief and regret. "I'm so sorry, Lily," he whispered, his voice breaking as he stroked her soot-stained cheek. "I'm so sorry. I put you in the middle of this. I used you. I was so focused on my revenge, on my pride." He leaned his forehead against hers, his own tears mixing with the grime on her face. "I love you," he confessed to her still, silent form. "God, I love you. I should have told you. I should have just walked away from all of it and taken you with me." As if his words had reached her through the darkness, her eyelids fluttered. She coughed, a weak, rattling sound. "Vincent," she whispered, her voice hoarse. Relief, so powerful it was a physical blow, slammed into him. "I'm here, Lily. I'm here." She coughed again, her eyes slowly focusing on his face, then on the fire around them. "We're trapped," she rasped. "I'll get us out," he promised, though he had no idea how. She shook her head weakly, a flicker of the old analytical light returning to her eyes. She looked around the room, her gaze scanning the walls. "No," she whispered, pointing a trembling finger toward the wall behind Marco's heavy oak desk. "There." "What?" he asked, confused. "When I worked construction with my dad, summers in college," she explained, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "I learned to read blueprints. Old buildings like this, they have service passages, hidden between the main walls." She coughed again, the smoke thick in her lungs. "That wall, it's not structural. There's a space behind it. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one they had." He rushed to the wall, his hands feeling along the wood paneling. He found it, a slight indentation, a seam that wasn't quite perfect. He pulled, and a section of the wall swung inward, revealing a dark, narrow, smoke-filled passage, their only chance. But as he looked inside, his heart sank. The passage was blocked by a heavy, fallen steel beam, a casualty of the fire's structural damage. It was too heavy for one person to move. He turned back to Lily, who was struggling to sit up, the hope on her face dying as she saw the new obstacle. "It looks like we're stuck after all," Vincent said, his voice a low, grim rumble as the roar of the fire grew louder, closer. Outside, in the chaotic swirl of flashing lights and shouting firefighters, Marco and Isabella watched the west wing of the hotel burn. A cruel, triumphant smile played on Isabella's lips. It was over. Vincent and the waitress were gone. The company, the empire, would soon be theirs. "It's a tragedy," Marco said to a nearby police captain, his voice dripping with a false, well-rehearsed grief. "Vincent, he was like a brother to me." The fire chief approached, his face grim. "I'm sorry, sir," he said to Marco. "The fire in that wing is too intense. The structure is unstable. We can't send anyone in. There's no chance of survivors." Isabella had to physically restrain herself from smiling. It was perfect. And then, the impossible happened. With a deafening roar, a section of the building's sidewall, far from the main entrance, exploded outward in a shower of brick and plaster. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. As the dust began to settle, two figures emerged from the gaping hole, silhouetted against the flames like specters from a fiery hell. It was Vincent and Lily. He was half carrying, half supporting her, his suit jacket wrapped around her head to protect her from the smoke. They were both covered in soot, bruised, and breathing heavily, but they were alive. Vincent, a man who always had a contingency plan, had used the small, discreet explosive charge he carried in his pocket for emergencies, a last resort he had never had to use before, to blast their way out. He helped Lily to a nearby ambulance, ensuring she was safe and being attended to by paramedics before he did anything else. Then he turned. His eyes, burning with a cold, righteous fury, scanned the crowd and found Marco. Marco was staring at him, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated shock and horror. His plan, so perfectly executed, had failed. Vincent walked toward him, his steps slow, deliberate, menacing. The crowd parted before him. He stopped directly in front of his partner, his face a grim, unreadable mask. "You were right, Marco," Vincent said, his voice a low, dangerous growl that carried in the sudden, tense silence. "He trusts me completely. He'll never suspect a thing." He held up his phone. And in the flashing red and blue lights of the emergency vehicles, he pressed play. Marco's own voice, smug and treacherous, echoed through the night air from the phone's speaker. "He'll never suspect a thing," followed by Isabella's cruel, mocking laughter. "He always was naive. It's why he's about to lose everything." A collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers and company employees. The betrayal, so blatant, so absolute, was laid bare for all to see. The police captain, who had been standing nearby, looked from the phone to Marco, his expression hardening. Two of his officers began to move toward Marco and Isabella, their hands resting on their holsters. It was over. The arrest was swift and decisive. Marco, his face a mask of stunned disbelief, offered no resistance. Isabella, however, fought, her elegant facade cracking to reveal the snarling, cornered animal beneath. She screamed accusations, threats, her words lost in the cacophony of sirens and the shocked murmurs of the crowd. Vincent watched them being led away, his expression unreadable. The empire his family had built was safe. The traitors had been exposed. He had won. But as he looked at the burning building, at the chaos, at Lily being treated by paramedics, it didn't feel like a victory. He and Lily were taken to the hospital to be treated for smoke inhalation and minor injuries. The silence between them in the back of the ambulance was heavy, thick with unspoken emotions. The crisis was over, but the chasm between their two worlds, a chasm that had almost killed them, remained. They were placed in a private room, the hum of the hospital machinery a stark contrast to the roar of the fire. They were both physically fine, but emotionally, they were shattered. The door to the room opened, and a man Vincent had not seen in years walked in. It was his father. Donatello Barone was a man carved from old-world stone. Even in his late 60s, he commanded a presence of absolute, intimidating power. He had officially retired, handing the reins of the family to Vincent, but his influence was still a long, dark shadow over everything. He surveyed the room, his cold, dismissive gaze sweeping over Lily, who sat on the edge of the hospital bed, before landing on his son. "You see?" Donatello said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble of disapproval. "You see what happens when you get involved with civilians, Vincent? When you let sentiment cloud your judgment?" He gestured vaguely at Lily. "Weakness. She almost destroyed everything our family has built." "She saved it," Vincent countered, his voice quiet but firm. "She's the one who discovered the betrayal." His father waved a dismissive hand. "A lucky guess. It doesn't change the fact that you risked a billion-dollar empire, your own life, for a waitress." He took a step closer, his eyes hard as granite. "This is a lesson, son, a final one. You have to make a choice." He paused, letting the weight of his ultimatum fill the silent room. "Her," he said, nodding his head contemptuously toward Lily, "or this family. You cannot have both." Vincent looked at his father, the man who had taught him everything about power, about control, about the cold, hard calculus of their world. Then he looked at Lily, at her soot-stained face, her brave, tired eyes, the woman who had shown him what it was to trust, to feel, to love. He was standing at the exact same crossroads that had haunted him for years, the choice that had defined his life, love or family, weakness or power. Vincent looked at his father, at the cold, unyielding patriarch who embodied the world he had been trying to escape. Then he looked at Lily, who sat pale and silent on the hospital bed, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and heartbreak. She was expecting him to choose his family. She was expecting to be abandoned, just as Elena had been. "You're right," Vincent said, his voice quiet but ringing with a newfound clarity. "I have to choose." He walked over to Lily, ignoring his father's impatient glare. He knelt before her, taking her small, soot-stained hands in his. "And I choose her," he said, his gaze locked on hers, his voice a low, fervent vow. He stood up and turned to face his father, a new, unshakable strength in his posture. "The family, the power, the money. It means nothing without her." He shook his head, a sad final smile on his lips. "You taught me that power is everything, Father. But you were wrong. It's a cage. And I'm done living in it." He looked at Lily, his love for her a tangible, brilliant thing in the sterile hospital room. "If the price for having her in my life is giving up everything else," he said, his voice clear and strong, "then I pay it. Gladly." Donatello Barone stared at his son, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He had lost. He had played his final card, and his son had refused to fold. Without another word, he turned and stormed out of the room, the sound of the door slamming shut echoing like a final, definitive break. They were alone. Truly alone. Without the power, the influence, the protection of the Barone family. "Vincent, what have you done?" Lily whispered, her eyes wide with shock and a dawning, terrifying understanding of the sacrifice he had just made. He smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in what felt like years. "I chose," he said simply. "For the first time in my life, I made my own choice." He sat on the edge of the bed beside her. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice small. He took her hand, his grip firm, steady. "We build something new," he said, his eyes shining with a hope and a determination she had never seen before. "Something that's ours." Leaving the Barone Empire was like stepping off a cliff. Vincent was now a pariah in the world he had once ruled. His assets were frozen, his connections severed. His father, in a final act of spite, had made sure he was left with nothing but the personal fortune he had amassed before taking over the family. A significant sum, but a pittance compared to the empire he had just abandoned. But for the first time in his life, Vincent felt free. And he was not alone. Lily was by his side, not as a damsel in distress or a protected lover, but as a true partner. The brilliant financial mind that had been dormant for years, the mind that had untangled Marco's complex web of deceit, was now fully unleashed. "You're a genius at strategy and negotiation," she told him as they sat in their new, much smaller apartment, surrounded by boxes. "But you've always operated in a world without rules. I know the other world, the legitimate one. Let me help you navigate it." And she did. With her knowledge of finance and his innate, ruthless business acumen, they became a formidable team. They didn't try to rebuild his old empire. They built a new one, from the ground up. They started small, investing his personal capital in a struggling boutique hotel, a property the Barone Empire had deemed worthless. But Vincent saw its potential, and Lily saw the numbers. She restructured the debt, streamlined the operations, and rebranded it. He used his old-world charm and his intimidating presence to negotiate with suppliers and contractors, securing deals no one else could. The hotel flourished. They bought another, and then another. Within 2 years, their new company, LV Hospitality was the fastest-growing boutique hotel chain in the country. They were more successful and happier than Vincent had ever been. They had built an empire based not on fear and intimidation, but on intelligence, partnership, and a shared vision. One day, an unexpected visitor arrived at their new, sleek corporate headquarters. It was his father's old consigliere, a man named Antonio, who had served the Barone family for 50 years. "Vincent," Antonio said, his old eyes full of a weary respect. "The family is in chaos. Your father's health is failing. The old ways are dying. They need a leader. A real leader." He looked around at the bustling, successful office Vincent and Lily had built. "They need you, but not the old you. The new you." He slid a folder across the table. "They are offering you control again," Antonio said. "But this time, on your terms. You can merge your new company with the old. You can run it however you see fit. You can finally finish what you started." It was the ultimate vindication, the chance to reclaim his birthright, but to do it his way. He looked at Lily, who had been listening in silence. She simply met his gaze, her eyes full of love and trust. The choice was his. He looked back at Antonio. "I'll consider it," he said, "on one condition." Vincent did return, but not as a prodigal son returning to his father's throne. He returned as a conqueror, merging his new legitimate empire with the old, effectively swallowing the past. His condition had been absolute. He would have total control, with no interference. His father, old and frail, had no choice but to agree. The Barone family was transformed. Under Vincent's new leadership, the shadowy dealings were systematically dismantled, replaced by legitimate, profitable enterprises. He used the family's immense power and influence not to intimidate and destroy, but to build and protect. He became a respected, if still feared figure in the city, a man who had walked through the fire and emerged not just unscathed, but reborn. And Lily was by his side through it all. She was not just the Don's wife. She was the co-CEO of the new Barone empire, the brilliant financial mind behind their success, the quiet, steady force that tempered his ruthless ambition with compassion and integrity. She was respected, admired, and in some circles, feared even more than he was, for everyone knew she was the one person he would burn the world down for. The final scene takes place a year later, at the grand opening of their newest flagship hotel, the completely rebuilt and redesigned Heritage Hotel, the very place where she had been trapped in a fire. Vincent and Lily stood on the rooftop terrace, looking out at the glittering city lights. The party raged on below them, a celebration of their success. He turned to her, a soft, genuine smile on his face. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of an emotion he no longer tried to hide. "For what?" she asked, smiling back at him. "For saving me, Lily," he said, his voice a low, earnest murmur. "That night, in the boardroom, you saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life." She reached up and touched his cheek. "I didn't save you, Vincent," she said softly. "I just reminded you of the man you already were." He leaned down and kissed her, a slow, deep kiss that was not about passion or desire, but about a profound, soul-deep partnership. It was a kiss that held the weight of their shared past and the promise of their shared future. They were no longer a mafia boss and a waitress, a king and a pawn. They were a king and a queen, rulers of an empire they had built together, an empire founded not on the sins of the father, but on the trust, respect, and enduring love of his son.